Chapter 6, Parts 5 and 6 of A History of Greece to the Death of Alexander the Great, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Graham Redman. A History of Greece to the Death of Alexander the Great, Volume 1, by John Bagnell Bury. Chapter 6, Part 5. The European Expedition of Darius, Conquest of Thrace. Cyrus had conquered the eastern coasts of the Mediterranean. Cambyses had completed and secured that conquest on the south side by the subjection of Egypt. It remained for Darius to complete and secure his empire on the north side by the reduction of Thrace. The possession of the adjacent part of the European continent was of like importance to the lord of Asia Minor as the possession of the adjacent part of the African continent to the lord of Syria. Having spent 8 years in setting his house in order, Darius prepared for his European expedition. It seems probable that his original design was first to subdue the Thracian peoples as far as the Danube, so as to make that river the northern boundary of his empire, and secondly to extend his power westward over Macedonia. The Thracian race was warlike, and the country is mountainous, so that the Persian enterprise was serious and demanded large forces and careful precautions. The skill of a Samian architect named Mandrocles was employed to throw a bridge of boats across the Bosphorus north of Byzantium, and, when the Persian host had passed over, Darius ordered 2 pillars to be set up on the European side, inscribed with the names of the various peoples composing his army, in Greek and cuneiform characters. These pillars were seen by the historian Herodotus. And in the temple of Hera at Samos there was to be seen another monument of the crossing into Europe. Mandrocles spent a part of the reward which Darius gave him in setting up there a painting in which the bridge and the crossing over, with Darius seated in a prominent place, were portrayed. He inscribed on it 4 verses to this effect: "Having bridged the fishy Bosphorus, Mandrocles dedicated to Hera a memorial of his raft bridge. A crown he set upon his own head, and glory upon the men of Samos, for the work he wrought pleased King Darius." A large fleet was also furnished by the Greek subjects of Persia to sail along the Thracian coast of the Black Sea as far as the mouths of the Danube, and to support and co-operate with the army. The contingents of the various Greek cities were commanded by their despots, prominent among whom were Histiaeus of Miletus, Hippocles of Lampsacus, and Miltiades of the Thracian Chersonesus. No details of the warfare in Thrace are preserved. We are told that many tribes submitted, and the Getae signalized their love of freedom by refusing to surrender it without a struggle. It seems probable, however, that the Thracians made some preparations to meet the invader. North of the Danube, in the lands which are now called Wallachia and Moldavia, between the Danube, the Carpathians, and the Prut, lived tribes which were allied in many respects to the tribes south of the river. The Greeks included these tribes under the general name of Scythian, which they applied to the whole series of peoples who dwelled between the Carpathians and the Caucasus. While the most easterly of that series approximated in language to the Persian, the most westerly approximated to the Thracian. Nothing was more natural than that the people south of the Danube, threatened by an Asiatic invasion, should have taken steps to gain help from their neighbours on the north to oppose the Persian advance. Such help would have been readily given, and Darius doubtless became aware before he reached the Danube that the hostility of the Scythian beyond the Danube, whose frozen waters invited them to cross in winter, might be a frequent trouble to Persian rule in Thrace. The Greek fleet sailed up the mouth of the river, and a bridge of boats was thrown across. Darius and his army marched over into Scythia. But both the king's purpose and what he did in this remote corner of the world are hidden in a cloud of legend. That he may have wished to make a hostile demonstration and strike terror into the restless neighbours of Thrace is probable, but it is not the whole explanation. We may rather suppose that the chief object of the diversion beyond the Danube was to lay hands upon the gold mines of Dacia, which was then the land of the Agathyrsi, and to secure a route of communication between that land and the mouth of the Danube. For three facts seem to emerge from the mist. The first is that the Agathyrsi were active in opposing the march of the Persians. The second, that he erected forts on a river named the Oarus, a name otherwise unknown, but evidently a tributary of the Danube. The third, that his communications with the fleet which awaited his return were for some time cut off, and the Greek commanders were tempted to sail away and leave him in the lurch. He afterwards showed his gratitude to them for the loyalty with which they supported him in this expedition. The fact is that it would have been entirely contrary to their own interests to inflict a blow on the power which maintained despotism in the Greek cities of Asia Minor. But their loyalty at this juncture was all the more precious to the Persian king when he found on returning through Thrace that Byzantium, Perinthus, and Chalcedon had revolted. These revolts forced him to avoid the Bosphorus. He marched to the Thracian Chersonese and crossed the Hellespont, but left behind him an army under Megabazus, which was ultimately to complete the conquest of Thrace, and immediately to reduce the Greek cities along the northern coast of the Propontis and the Aegean. Megabazus established Persian dominion actually as far as the Strymon, and nominally even farther west, for the Paeonians between the Strymon and the Axius were conquered, and Macedonia acknowledged allegiance to the great king. The Persian dominion over the eastern part of the Balkan peninsula lasted for about 15 years, and it was increased by the acquisition of the islands of Lemnos and Imbros. The excursion of Darius beyond the Danube, so far as it was intended to make an impression on the Scythians, seems to have been effective. It is only when the Persian power is shaken by a Greek revolt, and Thrace herself is able to throw off the yoke, that we find Scythians overrunning Thrace, and even driving Miltiades out of the Chersonese. The European expedition of Darius had thus been a distinct success, which might fearlessly be set beside the Egyptian expedition of Cambyses. But it has come down to us in a very different and totally fabulous shape. It is represented as not primarily an expedition against Thrace, but as an attempt to execute the mad project of incorporating the Scythians of the steppes of southern Russia in the Persian Empire. In this story, which is told with all the art of Herodotus, Thrace appears merely as the way to Scythia, and the actual conquest of Thrace sinks into insignificance beside the ignominious failure of the Persian army to achieve the ultimate end of their wild enterprise, the conquest of Scythia. Darius, whose purpose is said to have been to take vengeance on the Scythians for their invasion of Media 100 years before, dispatches the Greek fleet to the Ister simply for the purpose of throwing a bridge of boats across the river. His first idea was to break down the bridge when he had passed over and send the ships home, but by the advice of a prudent Greek he changed his plan. He took a cord, in which he tied 60 knots, and said to the Greek captains, "Untie one of these knots every day, and remain here and guard the bridge till they are all untied. If I have not returned at the end of that time, sail home." The Greek historian Herodotus then conducts Darius with his vast host through the steppes of Scythia, as it were through fairyland, without any regard to the rivers which had to be crossed, the leagues which had to be traversed, the want of supplies. He carries him to regions beyond the Don, and transports the river Oaros, on which Darius built his forts, from the neighbourhood of the Danube to the neighbourhood of the Maeotic Sea, placing this imaginary march of the Persians in the midst of a poetical picture of the Scythian folks and the Scythian land. In returning to the Danube, the Persians found themselves in sore straits, chased and harassed by the barbarians, and meanwhile the 60 days had passed. The Ionians waited at the river beyond the ordained time, and presently a band of Scythians arrived, urging them to destroy the bridge, so that they might ensure the destruction of Darius and gain their own freedom. Miltiades, the tyrant of the Chersonese, strongly advocated the proposal of the Scythians, but the counter-arguments of Histiaeus of Miletus prevailed, for he pointed out that the power of the despots in the cities depended on the Persian domination. They pretended, however, to fall in with the Scythian proposal, and destroyed a part of the bridge on the northern side, so that the Scythians went their ways satisfied that the retreat of Darius would be cut off. A little later Darius arrived in the dark hours of the night, and was filled with terror when he could discover no bridge. An Egyptian with a loud voice shouted the name "Histiaeus" across the water, and Histiaeus, who was himself keeping guard, heard the cry, brought up his boats, and renewed the missing portion of the bridge. Thus Darius, after an ignominious retreat, was saved by the good offices of Histiaeus, whereas if the advice of Miltiades had been adopted, the subsequent Persian invasion of Greece might never have taken place. Thus Greek imagination, inspired by Greek prejudice, has changed a reasonable and successful enterprise into an insane and disastrous expedition, and the transmutation was so skilfully wrought that the fiction was taken for history until the other day. End of chapter 6, part 5. Chapter 6, part 6. The Ionic Revolt against Persia. The Persian conquest of Thrace and Macedonia was a step, though there is no reason for supposing it an intentional step, towards a Persian attempt to conquer Greece. The attempt on Greece was not made till more than 20 years later, and for the first 12 years after the return of Darius from Thrace nothing occurred which seemed likely to bring on a great struggle between Asiatic autocracy and European freedom. Hippias, the banished tyrant of Athens, repaired to Sardis and tried to induce the satrap Artaphernes to aid him in recovering his power. Artaphernes went so far as to threaten the Athenians. Envoys from Sardis said at Athens, "Take back Hippias if you look for safety." But he did nothing to enforce his menace. It was in consequence of events in which Hippias had no part that the expedition of the Persians against Athens was at last undertaken. The condition of politics in the island of Naxos led indirectly to an insurrection of the subject Greeks against the Persian power, and the part which Athens and other Greek cities played in connection with this revolt was the proximate cause of the Persian expeditions against Greece. In return for services rendered during the Thracian expedition, Histiaeus of Miletus was rewarded by Darius with a boon of his own requesting. He asked for Myrsinus, a town with fertile land on the lower Strymon, near the place where the famous Amphipolis was to be built at a later date, where he desired to found a colony. He seems to have accompanied Megabazus in his western march, and he set to work to fortify the place at once. Myrsinus was in the neighbourhood of silver mines, and there was abundance of wood suitable for shipbuilding. The Persian general thought it would be impolitic to allow a Greek colony to be planted in such a position, and communicated his views to the king, who was still at Sardis. And Darius, sending for Histiaeus on the plea that he was a friend whose company was indispensable, carried him off to Susa, with the full purpose of never allowing him to return to the Aegean. Thus the schemes of Histiaeus were cut short, and he spent 12 years in regrets at the court of Susa before he had an opportunity of resuming his connection with the politics of the Aegean. Miletus was governed by his son-in-law Aristagoras, a man whose ability fell short of his ambition, but famous in history as the originator of the revolt of the Ionian Greeks. To this man came a number of Naxian oligarchs, who had been expelled from their city by a democratic rising, begging for help to put down the people and gain possession of the populous and wealthy island. Aristagoras discerned in the request a means for his own aggrandizement, but without Persian assistance the enterprise did not seem feasible. He therefore went up to Sardis and unfolded to Artaphernes a project of reducing all the Cyclades, and then perhaps Euboea itself, a project of which the occupation of Naxos was to be the first step. Artaphernes readily entered into the plan, the consent of Darius was obtained, and 200 ships under the command of Megabates were placed at the disposal of the Milesian. There is little doubt that the enterprise would have been entirely successful but for a quarrel between Aristagoras and Megabates. The Persian admiral spitefully warned the Naxians of the approaching danger. The islanders made such effectual preparations that they stood a siege of 4 months, and, as there was then no likelihood of reducing the city, the fleet returned to Ionia. This failure was fatal to the prospects of Aristagoras. He had wasted Persian money, forfeited the confidence of Artaphernes, and made a powerful enemy in Megabates. He resolved to retrieve his fortunes by inciting a revolt of the Asiatic Greeks against the Persian power. The story was that his father-in-law, Histiaeus, weary of his long exile beyond the Tigris, instigated Aristagoras to this step by a secret message branded on the head of a faithful slave. This message is said to have reached Aristagoras just at the moment when he was meditating a rebellion, and to have decided him. The motive of Histiaeus in desiring the revolt is supposed to have been the conviction that Darius would send him down to Ionia to restore order, but the story sounds improbable. Histiaeus, detained at Susa because he was already deemed dangerous to Persian interests in the Aegean, would rather have had reason to fear that a revolt promoted by his son-in-law would prove fatal to his credit with Darius. It was a surprising thing that Darius was afterwards induced to send down such a near relative of Aristagoras, and we may suspect that the story that Histiaeus instigated the rebellion was suggested by his subsequent conduct, possibly even invented by himself. There were the seeds of revolt in Ionia, which only needed kindling to burst into flame. It would be a superficial view to suppose that the rebellion was due to the ambition of Greek despots. On the contrary, its indispensable condition was the widespread hatred of a despotic constitution which smouldered in the cities. And the despotic constitutions were part of the Persian system. An ambitious despot was indeed the means of calling this feeling into action, but in order to do so he had first to cease to be a despot. The initial step in promoting the rebellion was to set up democracies in the Greek states and drive out the tyrants. Aristagoras himself resigned his position in Miletus, and in most cases the change seems to have been accomplished without the shedding of blood. Mitylene was an exception. There the tyrant had earned such deep hatred that he was stoned to death. The next step was to obtain help from free Greece against the Persian power. Aristagoras undertook the mission. He went first to Sparta, but the Spartans refused to send help to free Ionia from Persian oppression, even as they had before refused to aid her against Persian invasion. In later days a delightful story was told of his visit. He went to King Cleomenes and showed him a map of the earth graven on bronze, displaying the countries of the known world, the seas, and the rivers. Cleomenes had never seen a map before, and the plausible Ionian tried to convince him that Sparta ought to aspire to the conquest of the Persian Empire. Cleomenes was impressed, but deferred his reply till the third day, and then asked Aristagoras the distance from Ionia to Susa. 3 months, said Aristagoras off his guard, and he would have described the road, but the king cut him short with the command, "Begone from Sparta, Milesian stranger, before the sun sets." Aristagoras made yet another attempt. Entering the house of Cleomenes as a suppliant, he sought to bribe him. Beginning with 10 talents, he gradually raised his offers till he reached 50. Then Gorgo, the king's daughter, a child of 8 or 9 years, cried out, "Father, the stranger will corrupt you." And moved by her words, Cleomenes left the room. The Milesian stranger fared better at Athens and Eretria. Both these cities sent succour. Athens 20 ships. Ships, says Herodotus, with the solemnity due to the historical significance of the moment, which were the beginning of ills between Greeks and barbarians. The prospects of success seemed unfavourable to those who were acquainted with the vast resources of the Persian Empire. When Aristagoras consulted with the men of leading at Miletus, the geographer Hecataeus had tried to dissuade him. Seeing that Aristagoras and the others had made up their minds and disparaged his arguments, Hecataeus gave a second best counsel. "If you do revolt, seize the treasure of the temple of Apollo at Didyma, and become masters of the sea, for if you do not, the enemy will." But the advice was not taken. With his Athenian and Eretrian allies, Aristagoras marched up to Sardis and occupied the city, but they did not take the citadel. While they were there, a fire broke out, and the town was burned to the ground. The Greeks left the smoking ruins and marched back to the coast, but near Ephesus they were met by a Persian force and defeated. The Athenians straightway returned home, and with this battle the part played by Athens in the Ionic revolt comes to an end. But the brief episode was to bring serious consequences upon her in the future. The burning of Sardis was important, not so much for the course of the revolt itself, as for what the revolt was to lead to. it irrevocably compromised two states of European Greece in the eyes of Persia. The story is that Darius, being told that Athenians had helped to burn Sardis, asked, "The Athenians, who are they?" He then called for a bow, and shooting an arrow into the air, invoked heaven, that it might be given to him to punish the Athenians. Moreover, he bade one of his slaves to say to him 3 times at dinner, "Sire, remember the Athenians." The story has no historical value, but it has artistic significance in the narrative of Herodotus. The historian, as has been well observed, marks, by the significant word and act, that he has entered on a new phase of his great subject, the strife between Greeks and barbarians. The revolt extended southwards to Caria and to Cyprus, northwards to the Propontis. In Cyprus all the cities except Amathus threw off the Persian yoke, but a Phoenician fleet was sent, and the island was recovered. The Hellespontine towns were also subdued. In Caria the insurgents, after suffering 2 serious defeats, succeeded in destroying a Persian army. But Aristagoras was a man of slight spirit, not meant by nature to be the leader of such a movement. Seeing that Persia prospered in dealing with the rebellion, he despaired of his cause, and fled to Marcinus in Thrace. It is said that he called a meeting of his adherents to decide what they should do and whither they should flee. In that assembly it was proposed to sail to the distant shores of Sardinia, and here again Hecataeus is related to have offered advice, which Aristagoras and his friends rejected, the establishment of a fortress in the neighbouring island of Leros, from which, if fortune favoured, they might easily return to Miletus. Aristagoras soon met his fate at the siege of a Thracian town. His death did not affect the course of the rebellion, in which he had played a sorry part. He has hardly left the stage when his father-in-law appears, but the role of Histiaeus is even less important than that of Aristagoras. This adventurer persuaded, or professed that he had persuaded, Darius to send him down to the coast by promising to suppress the insurrection before he changed his tunic, and to annex Sardinia to the dominion of the great king. This promise of Histiaeus, though it may not be true to fact, is thoroughly characteristic of the Greek adventurers of that time, deceiving themselves and others with speculations on the remote island of Sardinia. When he came down to Sardis, Histiaeus found that he was deeply suspected by the satrap Artaphernes, and feeling himself unsafe, he fled to Chios. There he embraced the cause of the rebels, asserting that he had instigated the revolt, and perhaps spreading the famous story of the message written on the slave's head. Having obtained some ships from Lesbos, he adopted the congenial business of piracy, occupying Byzantium and seizing the ships that attempted to pass the straits as long as the revolt lasted. In the end he was taken prisoner and crucified by Artaphernes. The main and decisive event of the war was the siege of Miletus, on which the Persians at length concentrated all their efforts. The town was blockaded by the squadron of 600 ships which had just reduced Cyprus. The Greek fleet was stationed off the island of Ladi. It is said to have numbered 353 ships, but they were ill-disciplined, and the contingents were not united under a single command, nor animated by a common spirit. In the battle which ensued, the Lesbians and Samians deserted. The men of Chios fought splendidly, but they were too few. Miletus was then taken by storm, the men were slain, and the women and children sent up to Susa. The temple of Apollo at Didyma, one of the chief oracular sanctuaries of the Greek world, was surrendered by the Branchidae, its hereditary priests, and was burnt down. Some of the statues which adorned the sacred way leading to the temple have partially survived. They are of great interest to the student of sculpture, but one of them is of interest also to the historian. It is a statue of Ceres of Tychiussa, who was doubtless a tyrant set up in that city by Darius, and thus it is a monument of the Persian domination in Ionia. We may suspect that the burning of Apollo's shrine was not approved of by Darius himself. The respect which the King of Kings felt for the oracular god is attested in a letter of admonition which he addressed to a satrap of Ionia. The text of a Greek version of this letter is partly preserved on a stone, and records the remarkable testimony of the king that Apollo always told the truth to the Persians. The capture of Miletus was followed by the reduction of Caria, where the rebels had for a time prospered, and by the conquest of the islands. Presently the Phoenician navy appeared in the waters of the Hellespont, and the attempt of eastern Greece to regain her independence was completely crushed. Though the Athenians had withdrawn from the movement in Ionia at an early stage, the tidings of the fall of Miletus produced at Athens a deep feeling of disappointment and sympathy, which found expression some time afterwards in the punishment of Phrynichus, a tragic poet, who made the catastrophe of Miletus the theme of a drama. The Athenians fined him for having recalled to their minds their own misfortunes. But in the meantime there had been won for them, from the Persian, what was destined to become afterwards a lasting possession. Miltiades, the tyrant of the Chersonese, took no part in the revolt, but he availed himself of it to strike for his own hand, and to seize the isles of Lemnos and Imbros. When the revolt failed, feeling himself unsafe in the Chersonese, he fled to Athens. His son was captured by the Persians, but was kindly treated by Darius, and this proves that Miltiades in his earlier career had been on friendly terms with Persia. At Athens he professed that he had conquered Lemnos and Imbros for her, and, though these islands seem to have been reoccupied by the Persians for a time, they passed back under Athenian dominion. End of chapter 6, part 6. Recording by Graham Redman.